The first time I really noticed her wasn't when she was carrying groceries, or when she came by to ask about the noise from my music. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind where nothing feels important, and I was sitting in the corner of the cafe near my building, pretending to read a book I'd already given up on. She walked in like she belonged to the place, not in any showy way, but the way you carry yourself when you've stopped worrying about how people see you. My aunt. Though we only started calling her that later, when we were still joking about how complicated it sounded. The barista knew her order before she opened her mouth. "Black, no sugar, in the chipped mug," he said, reaching for it. She laughed, not loud, but enough to make people glance up. I remember noticing how she leaned one hand on the counter like she was steadying herself against the day. I kept my eyes on the book but found myself timing my page turns with her movements. When she passed my table, she gave me that polite, neighborly smile. The one you give when you recognize someone but aren't sure if you should stop. I nodded back, too quickly. My thumb kept smoothing the same crease in the page over and over. She sat 2 tables away, close enough for me to hear the spoon against her mug, far enough to remind me she was not mine to approach. I don't know what it was. Maybe the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear, maybe the silence she carried like a second coat, but I couldn't look away for long. We'd spoken before. About recycling bins, about the landlord who never fixed things, about the mail that ended up in the wrong box. Never longer than a few minutes. But in those few minutes, she had this way of making me feel accounted for, like she'd seen me when no one else had. That day, I thought about saying something, anything. The weather, the book I wasn't reading, but my mouth stayed closed. Instead, I folded my napkin into tighter and tighter squares until it was small enough to hide in my palm. When I finally stood to leave, she glanced up. "You didn't like the book?" she asked, tilting her chin toward the table. Her voice was steady, but I caught the flicker of amusement in her eyes. "Too many big words," I said, clumsy, too quick. My ears burned. She smiled, just enough for her lips to press against the rim of the chipped mug. "Maybe you'll finish it next time." I left the cafe with the napkin still clenched in my hand. Walking back, I felt ridiculous for not asking her something real. But when I got to my apartment, there was a message on my phone. From her. Just 7 words. "Don't tell anyone," but I noticed too. I read it 3 times, then sat down on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, the folded napkin between my fingers like some kind of proof. I didn't know what she meant. Or maybe I did, and I was just afraid to admit it. Either way, something had shifted. A week after the cafe, she knocked on my door. I almost didn't answer. My apartment was a mess, laundry piled in corners, half-finished meals stacked in the sink. But her knock was soft, and for some reason it made me think of the text she'd sent. I opened it. She was holding a small plant, one of those low-maintenance ones that can survive almost anywhere. "It was sitting in the hallway too long," she said. "Didn't know if it was yours or if someone abandoned it." I shook my head. "Not mine." She tilted her head. "Then maybe it should be. Looks like your place could use some green." I stepped aside before I could second-guess it. She walked in without ceremony, her eyes taking in the clutter. She didn't comment, just set the plant on the windowsill and dusted her hands. We sat at my table while I boiled water for tea. The silence stretched, but not in a painful way. She seemed comfortable filling it with small gestures, straightening the corner of a magazine, tapping her finger lightly on the mug I set in front of her. "Divorce papers came through last year," she said suddenly, staring at the steam rising from her tea. "It's strange. You wait for closure, and when it comes, it's quieter than you expect." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, holding my mug too tightly, feeling the heat against my skin. She glanced at me then, her eyes softer than before. "Sorry, you didn't ask for that." I didn't mind. I could have told her I knew what quiet felt like, that I'd written texts I never sent, stayed up nights imagining conversations I'd never have, that being 20-something didn't mean being fearless. It meant sometimes feeling invisible. But the words stuck. Instead, I said, I don't know why that moment in the cafe stayed with me. Maybe because she started coming by in small ways after that, borrowing sugar, asking if I could carry a box up the stairs. Little excuses that didn't feel like excuses until later, when I thought about how easily she could have asked anyone else. One evening, she leaned against my doorway while I struggled with a stubborn jar lid. You always over-tighten things, she said, smiling faintly. She took it from me, tapped the rim against the counter, and twisted it open like it was nothing. I muttered thanks, embarrassed at how grateful I felt for something so small. We sat on my couch, the open jar on the table, music low in the background. Not really talking, just existing in the same space. That should have been easy. But I kept catching myself watching the way she rested her hands in her lap, fingers curled loosely, as if she were keeping them from reaching for something. Or someone. I wanted to ask her what she meant that day in the cafe. About noticing too. The words hovered on the edge of my tongue. But before I could, my phone buzzed on the table. A friend's name lit up the screen. She glanced at it, then back at me. Quick, unreadable. I let it ring out, face warm, pulse louder than the music. You should answer, she said, though her voice was softer than the words. I don't feel like it. Her eyes lingered on mine for a second too long, and then she shifted, pulled back into herself, as though she'd remembered something. I shouldn't spend too much time here, she murmured. The room went heavier. I laughed, awkward, rubbing the back of my neck. You're just helping me open jars. But neither of us believed that. The next day at the cafe, one of the regulars raised an eyebrow when he saw us walk in together. He made a small joke about me bringing my aunt along, and I felt her body stiffen beside me. She smiled politely, brushing it off. But when we sat down, her hands stayed wrapped around her cup, unmoving, as if anchoring herself. You don't have to sit with me, she said. I shook my head. I want to. She breathed out, somewhere between relief and worry. Silence stretched, the clock on the wall ticking too loud. I thought I'd lost her again. But then she leaned just slightly closer, enough that I caught the faintest trace of her perfume. My chest tightened. The words almost slipped out. I could feel them pressing at my throat. Instead, I looked at her hand, resting on the table, and let mine drift near. Not touching, just close enough for the air to shift between us. She didn't move, didn't pull away, and for a heartbeat I thought she might close the gap herself. It rained that night. Not heavy, just enough to mist the windows and make the pavement shine. I found myself standing outside her door again, this time with no excuse, no jar, no plant, no reason at all. Just the sound of my heartbeat and the memory of her polite smile still lodged in my chest. I almost turned back. Then the door opened. She must have heard me pacing, or maybe she'd been waiting too. She stood there in a cardigan, sleeves pulled over her hands like she wanted to hide them. You're soaked, she said, voice low. I nodded. I was walking. She let me in. The kitchen light was dim, soft yellow against the rain tapping the glass. We sat at her table, a teapot between us. Neither of us touched it. Finally, she said, That man you saw, he's my ex. He thinks there's something to salvage. There isn't. Her eyes stayed on her hands, twisting the edge of her sleeve. I didn't want you to think. She stopped. I didn't, I said too quickly. Then quieter. I just didn't know what you wanted me to think. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt thinner, fragile, like it might break with one wrong word. She exhaled, steadying herself. I promised myself after everything, I wouldn't get close again. Not like that. Not with anyone. She glanced at me, then looked away before I could answer. I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw. Then break that promise, I said. My voice surprised me. It wasn't bold. It wasn't even sure. Just tired of holding everything in. Her hand stilled. The sleeve slipped back, revealing her wrist resting on the table. My fingers twitched toward it before I pulled them back. She noticed. Her lips curved, not into a smile, but something more complicated. You don't know what you're asking. Maybe not, I admitted. But I know how it feels when you're not here. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain. Then, slowly, carefully, she reached across the table. Her fingertips brushed mine. Barely there, a whisper of touch. Enough to make the air shift. I didn't close the distance. Neither did she. But neither of us moved away. Her eyes lifted to mine, searching. What are we doing? The question hung there, suspended between us. I didn't have an answer, and maybe that was the point. Time didn't stop for us. It never does. Weeks passed, and life found its rhythm again. Work, errands, the sound of the mail slot at noon. But the silence between us had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. She came back to the cafe one morning. 8:47 a.m. Exactly the time she always used to arrive. The chipped mug was ready on the counter before she even asked. I was already there, book open but unread, hands restless against the table. When she walked in, our eyes caught. Not startled, not guilty, just steady. Like we both knew this was how it would be. She sat across from me. No words at first, just her fingers curling around the mug, my thumb smoothing the crease of a napkin. We didn't need to fill the space. That was the difference now. Later, we walked home together, stopping at the same bench with the carved initials. The paint was peeling a little more. She brushed away a leaf, sat down, and patted the spot beside her. I used to think promises kept me safe, she said quietly. But sometimes they just keep you lonely. I didn't answer. I just let my hand rest near hers, the way I had once before. This time she didn't hesitate. Her fingers slipped into mine, warm, certain, like she'd decided. We sat like that until the shadows stretched longer than we meant to. Nothing dramatic, just two people choosing not to leave. I think about it sometimes. How the world kept moving, bills still due, coffee still bitter, neighbors still nodding in hallways. Nothing extraordinary happened, and yet everything did. When I look back, it isn't the rain or the arguments or even the silence I remember most. It's the chipped mug, the napkin folded too many times, the way she finally let go of a promise, and how I finally learned what it meant to be seen. And that's enough. Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next? It was late afternoon, the kind where the sun slips low but doesn't quite commit to setting. We'd both finished errands and ended up walking the same stretch of sidewalk back toward the building. She carried a paper bag with tea. I had nothing but my hands shoved deep in my jacket pockets. At the corner, she stopped by the bench with the chipped paint and initials carved into the wood. She sat without asking, the paper bag balanced on her lap, and I followed, pretending it was the natural thing to do. For a while, neither of us spoke. The sound of passing cars filled the air, then faded. I tapped my foot against the pavement, wishing I could swallow the nerves out of my body. She, on the other hand, leaned back slightly, watching the branches above us shift in the wind. Then, suddenly, she said, "You don't know what this looks like." Her voice was calm, but I could hear the strain beneath it. I frowned. What looks like?" She turned to me, eyes steady. "You, me, sitting here like this. People notice things. a knot pulled tight in my chest. Do you care what they notice? She didn't answer right away, just folded the edge of the paper bag down, too carefully, like she needed her hands to do something. Finally, I care about losing control. I promised myself, after the divorce, after everything, that I wouldn't let anyone close enough to make me feel that again. Her words pressed into the silence harder than if she'd shouted. I shifted, leaned forward, elbows on my knees. My voice came out low, almost a whisper. But you already have. That stopped her. She blinked, lips parting just slightly, then closed them again like she'd thought better of speaking. The air between us tightened. She reached up, smoothed a strand of hair behind her ear, her hand trembling just enough that I noticed. You're too young to understand what that costs. I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was the same excuse I'd been giving myself. Maybe, but I know what it costs not to say anything. Her head turned then, sharply, as if the words had caught her off guard. Our eyes met, longer than we'd ever held before. Felt exposed, like standing in the middle of the street with no cover. I almost reached for her hand. Almost. My fingers twitched, then stilled. She must have seen it, because she whispered, "Don't." Not firm, not certain, just the word hanging there, unfinished. The silence was unbearable, but I couldn't move. Finally, she asked, so softly I nearly missed it, "What happens if we don't stop?" The day after the bench, she wasn't at the cafe. Not the next day either. The chipped mug stayed on the shelf, gathering dust no one else seemed to notice. I told myself it was nothing. People miss routines. But after a week, the silence turned heavier. When I passed her door in the evenings, I thought I heard movement, a shadow through the crack, but the hallway stayed quiet. I never knocked. Finally, she appeared, walking in with someone beside her. A girl, maybe my age, maybe younger. The resemblance was enough that I didn't need to ask. Her daughter. She carried herself with a kind of brightness that made me feel suddenly foolish for ever thinking the silence had been about me. We crossed paths at the stairwell. She smiled, polite, quick. "This is Anna," she said, her hand brushing her daughter's shoulder. "She's staying with me for a while." I mumbled something, couldn't hold Anna's gaze for long. The older woman didn't linger either. They disappeared behind her door, voices muffled, domestic. After that, everything shifted. She didn't stop completely. There were still nods in the hallway, brief words exchanged over the mail. But the softness we had built seemed gone, replaced by a careful distance. As if she was afraid her daughter would notice or worse, understand. I started avoiding the cafe. My table felt too empty, the napkin too clean. Instead, I walked longer routes, circling blocks for no reason. My phone stayed heavy in my pocket, drafts unsent. "Are you okay? Did I ruin this? Should I pretend it never happened?" Each time I deleted before sending. One night I saw the two of them at the bench. Same place she and I had sat, only now she was laughing, Anna's head on her shoulder. The sight tightened something inside me. Not anger, not heartbreak, just a hollow pause like I'd been written out of a script mid-scene. Later, sitting in my room, I opened a blank message and typed. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. I stared at it for a long time. The words looked wrong and right all at once. Then I closed my phone. The message stayed unsent. The sentence unfinished.